top three risk management tips?
So there's a lot of factors I think to consider when it comes to risk management. In terms of three tips, if I had to list, I would say uh, probably first would be, well, overall, I guess a good theme would be organization. So the first thing I would recommend is that you need to establish some sort of baseline. It's hard to address and remediate any sort of risk when you don't really know, what the baseline is that you're comparing that to. And so you need to kind of evaluate what your exposure is.
I would say my number one would be organization. So make sure to keep the things you're doing documented, the things you need to do documented, and you're keeping track of your steps to what you did in order to manage that risk. So having that documentation throughout, to me, is going to make the process a lot easier, and a lot easier to understand looking back as well. So that would definitely be my number one, would just be organization and documentation.
My first one would be to audit regularly. You need to know where your organization stands, what it's trying to achieve, and what needs to be addressed.
I'd say routine checks on whatever systems you're trying to avoid risks in. Information is half the battle with any kind of risk management program. Just knowing where your problem areas are is a big part of what we focus on in our audits. So I think to get a good idea of how a system is, you need to regularly check it over, because even mild changes in policy or systems can oftentimes create holes that otherwise wouldn't have been there and you might not expect otherwise.
Secondly, it would be make sure all your policy documentation is in order. It's one of the, in my opinion, one of the easier things to do and one of the more important things to do to make sure that from a strategic perspective that you are aligned with that your organization is aligned with the goals it set out for itself. So that's kind of the immediate follow-up to the first tip of audit yourself, figure out where you want to be, and then make sure your policy is helping push you that direction.
A second one, I would think, I'd say that periodic meets with any kind of stakeholders of, investors, project leaders, basically anyone who would have some sort of a sway over the system we're looking at risks at. Oftentimes, if we do identify a hole or something like that, to make the necessary adjustments, we have to get it through other stakeholders, of course, and a lot of times it can take a good bit of time to get schedules aligned or to get these everyone notified and responding in a timely manner. So I think just having normally we call IRC meetings here, like a risk council of representatives across the company who can speak to whether or not we can issue these changes. Something like that on a routine basis gives a good opportunity to have everyone there at once to discuss whatever changes we might want to push out, and can, I think, oftentimes lead to a quicker resolution of any gaps that we might want to push through.
Second would probably be working on a system to prioritize those. It'd be nice to say that everything's important, everything needs to be taken care of as soon as possible, but you've got to also be realistic, I think. And so, especially for smaller to medium-sized businesses, obviously resources, budget, those sorts of things can be limited. And so you've really got to address, what's most critical, most important first, because at the end of the day, you might not have the luxury of taking care of everything. And so look at, the types of data that could be impacted, the systems that could be impacted, what might be deemed critical, what could be detrimental to both your business and your clients, any related vendors, third parties, and that sort of thing.
User access reviews are huge. And I feel like there's probably not enough emphasis on those from a risk management perspective in a lot of different organizations. So making sure you're doing them regularly. Quarterly is usually best. Could even be more frequent if you wanted. But two, make sure you're doing them thoroughly. So look at all of your systems. It's not just your emails and your calendars. It's not just Slack. Your Google Workspace, all these things, all the systems you use, all the way through the Jira, AWS Access, things like that. Each and every system should have those access reviews done, and just doing that alone can have huge positive impacts on your your risk tolerance and your landscape for risk throughout your company.
The third and final is to consider that there's more options to risk management than just completely nullifying it by some means or accepting it entirely. Like there's means like transmission of risk, where we would, instead of hosting data on an internal platform, maybe we'll put it in Dropbox or something, and then through our contracts with Dropbox, we make it their responsibility to prevent data breaches on their end. And oftentimes, maybe even a full mitigation isn't necessary. Sometimes just reducing 80% of a risk is enough in some cases. 80-20 rule, 80% of the effort gets you 20% of the results, and vice versa. I think with that philosophy in mind, you can open up a lot of new strategies for addressing these risks, and can help you make probably more informed decisions in alignment with what you can afford to commit towards risk management.
Okay, third one is going to be low friction fixes. So when it comes to actually managing or sort of mitigating a risk, you want to make sure whatever solution you have in place is going to work for everybody involved. The higher friction, or the more trouble it is to implement, the more pushback you're going to get, and the harder it's going to be for that remediation to actually be effective.
I would say my third tip would probably be to regularly meet with all of the parties involved in making risk management decisions for the context of organization. So get as much of the senior leadership as possible to meet and talk about risk management, and that way you can continue to get a better idea of where you want your organization to be postured as far as risk tolerance and risk management. And with that kind of strategic level thinking and direction, you can really push yourself towards your goals for risk management.
The third thing would be a organized structure of addressing and tracking the remediation of those risks. So you don't just want to throw them out there and informally and ask someone to fix this when you get a chance. I think it's good to have a system in place where these can be tracked and kind of see what who's going to be like the owner of that, and see the progress that's made to address those risks. Is it going to be accepted? Is it going to be transferred? To like, for example, insurance, cyber insurance. You can transfer that risk. Is it going to be mitigated? You're going to buy a new tool, the software tool that's going to help with that issue. So there's a lot of ways you can go about that. And so I think if you kind of, start with those three things, that you'll be in a pretty good spot when it comes to risk management.